Tonight, we are going to talk about Comcast possibly gobbling up Time Warner, but we begin with the extreme weather conditions around the globe, and the latest one happening this week around the country. Power outages, accidents, deaths, lost wages. This is hitting much of the country, much of our pocketbooks. Tom, let's start out with you. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Atlanta and Philadelphia not being too prepared for these storms. How are we doing on this one?
Well, we're doing better, but better isn't saying much. You've essentially shut down the eastern half of the country for days at a time. Look at the effect on lost productivity, on canceled aircraft flights, on cars that get stuck. This is a giant event. And the thing is, I think, that we are now living in a series of these giant events, which, stacked end to end, make it look like we're living in a science fiction movie about the end times. If you were to project this vision of our weather for an audience in the 1960s or 70s and say, this is what the 21st century will be like, they would look back at you and say, well, of course, the world is coming to an end because of environmental depredation or, the various obsessions people had in the 60s and 70s. We live in an era of very extreme weather, which we are not doing adequate planning for. And I think the political dimension is that, there's a federal debate to be had about how much money we put aside for recovery from hurricanes and ice storms and massive damage from natural disasters like this, which are occurring over and over again in quick succession. It's very, very disturbing. And we are sort of like the frog in the pot whose water is getting turned up little by little. We get one of these a month or one every couple of months. It doesn't seem so bad. But look at the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and it's obvious that we are in a dramatically different weather cycle, which is really frightening.
Rich, why do you think that this government, not just this administration, but the government has not been adequately prepared for these? Do you think that it's some of those naysayers, the people who don't even think that climate change or global warming, whatever you want to term it, exists?
No, I think a lot of it is that I think plans are in place. It's a matter of executing those plans. Now, in a state like Georgia, where Governor Nathan Deal bear the brunt of a lot of criticism for not being prepared, I think there was a storm in place in Georgia. It was more an instance of they didn't really expect it to happen. It wasn't on the top of his radar necessarily. I mean, when you get elected governor of Georgia, the last thing you're thinking about is snowstorms. Just like if you get elected governor of Connecticut, you're not necessarily thinking of earthquakes. Something like that happens. It's it's just an oh, what do I do type of a moment. I don't necessarily think, in terms of the whole climate change debate, I don't think that necessarily plays a role here in terms of the weather. I think this is it's more parochial than anything else. It's interesting. One government agency which I think is quite popular, even in some of the most conservative parts of the country, is the Federal Emergency Management Administration. You go to places like Louisiana during the hurricanes, or if there's a tornado in Arkansas, some of the more conservative states, for example, FEMA's there. FEMA's there. I remember Bill Clinton used to always come down there and say, we're going to have the resources for you. Even in places like New Orleans, I mean, there are always arguments, why people would live in places like New Orleans or Situate, Massachusetts, or places where let's just say are storm prone. But the fact of the matter is, when there is a disaster and FEMA is there, I think most Americans are grateful that they're putting taxpayer money into that specific agency.
Tom, what do you think?
Well, we haven't put nearly enough money into FEMA or into disaster prep. FEMA is on the first response lines, but they are billions and billions of dollars over budget or underfunded. These are going to start to be policy questions. What is the annual light item for disaster in this country if we have the equivalent of a Superstorm Sandy, or a string of tornadoes, or a Katrina, or a series of killer ice storms bearing down on us at the rate of 1 or 2 a year? It's not unreasonable to start thinking about which segments of the country you would discourage habitation in, or at least to decide not to insure people in. It's not unreasonable to think about encouraging people to move out of the paths of our killer storms, Tornado Alley, or to discourage certain kinds of investment. This is a giant federal policy waiting to be made. I don't think it's because there's an ideological fight over climate change. And, you can fight all day about who is responsible for climate change or whether it's how much of it, if anything, is because of human greenhouse gas creation. But you can't really debate anymore that the weather is weirdly dramatically terrible compared to the relatively benign winters of our youth, 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah.
We're having terrible, terrible killer storms, 100-year floods and more at the rate of 1 or 2 a year.
But
we have to do something about it from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, but Tom, there are those people who are still questioning whether climate change or global warming is happening. One of the, I think the deputy prime minister in England said, of critics of the climate policy in England, I thought this was interesting. He blamed them of willfully being ignorant, head in the sand, NIMBYist conservatives. Is that happening here too?
Yeah, don't confuse the objective weather data with the argument over causation, which are two entirely different issues. There has been bad science on both sides, both the people trying to promote the notion that human beings are responsible and, calling for drastic greenhouse gas policy changes, and people who deny that. And I just don't know. I don't know who to trust. I think there's some evidence on both sides, but you can't really deny that what is clearly a statement of absolute fact is that the number of billion-dollar natural disasters owing to weather has gone up like a shot in the last 30 years. Now, I don't know if that's because you drive your car to go get pizza or not, but it's beside the point. The real question is, how do you deal with the disasters we do get? And we're not showing any spine on that score.
And I agree with you.
Let me just say this about climate.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say this about climate change. The dissenters, or those, are often viewed as people who deny that global warming is happening. They're not necessarily, or for that matter, climate change. They're not denying that it's happening. It's the severity. What they're saying is that there are a lot of scientists who they think are making a lot of money off of this, and that they would basically be blackballed if they were to make a counter argument. That's what this whole kind of ClimateGate thing is about. They're not necessarily saying, by the way, that humans have have absolutely nothing to do with carbon emissions. What they're saying is more the severity of it, and I think it's really sad, and it's kind of supercilious on the part of a lot of the kind of the hysterics on those who think that we need to go all out in terms of carbon taxes, regulating carbon footprints, cap and trade, all this other stuff. They tend to treat those who are skeptical of the amount that humans are causing as somehow second-class citizens, or they're often compared to members of the Flat Earth Society. A lot of them aren't. And a lot of them, by the way, are not necessarily paid by the energy company, or the energy companies are. Now, there are some that are paid by the energy companies, but that is not necessarily, they're not necessarily a monolith. There are a lot of people out there who really think that this is hysteria. You can go back to the 1970s when there was a Newsweek, when there was a big cover about the global cooling, for example. So it's not necessarily an either or. It's not necessarily are humans causing it, or do they have absolutely nothing to do with it. And I think it's interesting. I just think it's very kind of supercilious on the part of people like Al Gore that they don't debate people on the other side, because what they're trying to do essentially, and I think it's a political stunt, is they're trying to basically marginalize these people by saying, these people are just kind of, they're flat earthers and the people who don't think we really went on the moon. But there are actually a lot of, there are MIT scientists, there are a lot of people who aren't being paid by the energy industry who are skeptical of the amount that humans are contributing to global warming, and they should not be treated like second-class citizens, or like people who think that we never went to the moon, or that everything's a conspiracy.
Regardless, like Tom said, climate change is now an occurrence, and this has been a campaign platform for a lot of politicians who vowed to do something about it, namely President Barack Obama. And now he's being accused of being, even though he is being accused of being one of the biggest regulators of big companies in terms of the environment, there's not much talk about addressing climate change, Tom.
Well, Obama campaigned and won election partly. Do you remember his inaugural speech about we'll remember this is the time when the oceans were rolled back and, the planet started revolving in the opposite direction and all these incredible things were going. Well, none of that happened, and now President Obama is the quietest man in the room when it comes to climate policy. He's given up, apparently, on a lot of fronts, but especially on environmental policy, and he's disappointed the environmentalist lobby no end, not just over this. I think that it's probably foolhardy to pursue greenhouse gas legislation for all the reasons Rich said. There's just too much debate about this. It's inexcusable not to come up with a blanket federal policy on coping with the effects of superstorms and serious natural disasters that result from climate change. We don't know if this is a bubble that's going to go on for another 5 years and quit, or if this is the new normal and it's going to go on for the rest of our lives, maybe get twice as bad, but we should be thinking about these things instead of watching American Idol and pretend nothing's going on. This is really serious business. It is quality of life. It's continuation of life in many parts of the country. And it's not being discussed.
And around the world, 60 degrees in Sochi at the bottom of a ski mountain. I mean, this is something that is affecting the rest of the world. Go ahead, Rich.
If I could just digress a minute, for all those who kind of view, I wouldn't say as a messiah, but Al Gore as kind of, as kind of the tribune of this movement. Remember, Al Gore has been wrong before in terms of politically. He's changed his mind on things before. Remember, in the 1988 presidential campaign, for example, I remember Al Gore saying that homosexuality was abnormal behavior and something that should not be tolerated. He got the endorsement of members of the Westboro Baptist Church. That year, for example, he used to be very pro gun, pro NRA. He used to be opposed to abortion rights. He supported the Hyde Amendment, saying that no federal funding should go toward abortion funding. So I mean, this is not somebody who necessarily you should listen to and say that everything that he says is the God's honest truth. I mean, he's changed his positions on many political things. He's a politician who used to be a very conservative Democrat who's moved very far to the left since his presidential campaign. Doesn't mean he hasn't had many good ideas in the past, but it just means that you should not treat him as necessarily as a messiah or as a tribute. He's a politician who, by the way, when he ran for president in 2000, never made a speech about global warming.
Go ahead, Tom.
Right. This is the guy who took a lot of tobacco money as a senator from Tennessee before he got on the ticket with Clinton and gave this emotional speech about how evil and appalling the tobacco companies were, and he would fight them till his last breath. This is the guy who made a lot of money selling that Inconvenient Truth movie and doing speaking engagements around the country until he sold Current TV and pocketed more than $400 million
to Al
from the
Jazeera.
Qatari oil state. And now he doesn't make those speeches so much anymore. So I wouldn't prepare any gold thrones for Al Gore on this. But the fact is that the rhetoric around climate change has been so emotional and so self-loathing and accusatory on the part of the liberal elites who control the conversation that it's very difficult to hold a rational discussion about what's going on. And that, as much as anything else, is perhaps why President Obama has just decided to shut up and let the planet freeze or fry or whatever without any federal intervention.
It's interesting. In '87, the Westboro Baptist Church endorsed Al Gore over Pat Robertson in the Republican Party because they thought Al Gore was more socially conservative. I mean, he is not necessarily the epitome of consistency.
All right,
at least Pat Robertson still has his own TV show. Al Gore, not so much.
Good point. All right, let's move on to this proposed merger by Comcast by Time Warner for $45 billion. Of course, the federal government still has to approve it. But, Tom, we've seen a string of these mergers. These companies are getting huge, and they're not just into, Comcast, internet, and video. They're getting into far more bigger things. First, your reaction about this proposal.
Well, I'm against it. Whenever a captain of industry comes around with a great big merger and makes a speech about how pro-consumer this is going to be, how it's going to improve competition and open up options, check your wallet, because the technical term for that in the business world is lying. We have seen great big banks recover from the 2008 crash and spread their wings in all kinds of nasty ways to the point where they've reduced competition in the banking world, snatched up all the small banks. We have seen airline consolidation in this country over the last 5-6 years, to the point we're down for a handful, 3 or 4 major airlines compared to a dozen or so 20 years ago. And there's less competition, poorer fares, higher prices, and less reliability. And now, perhaps most frightening, you are seeing consolidation of the people who control the information pipe into your homes. And when you control the pipe, you have the power to say what people are going to be exposed to. Yeah. You can control the channels on the cable lineup and throw the ones off that you don't like. You can meter people's access to certain websites, which is what the net neutrality fight is all about. And the fewer players you have in the business, the more apt the consumer is to get screwed. So this is a very dark development for people who have to live with Comcast. There is no meaningful competition usually in the markets where Comcast does business, and it's just another data point suggesting that President Obama and his administration allies are closet corporatists who are much more interested in currying favor with the kinds of people who run these companies than with making sure you and I have a reliable airline to fly or a full cable lineup to watch.
Very interesting. But Tom, you say the administration, but a lot of people have blamed the repeal of the GlassSteagall Act in 1999, a law that was in the books, I think, since the 30s, for the possibility
1933, yeah.
1933.
Yeah, well, it's a post-crash law from 33, I think, or so. Repealed for the most part in 1999. It took a good 8 to 10 years for people to see what the heck the effects would be. But the real remarkable thing is that we've understood the catastrophic effects of no Glass-Steagall barriers on banks getting into brokerage and investment activity. We've understood it since about early 2008. What have we done about it? Nothing. We don't intend to. The West Wing under this administration has been stocked from the start with refugees from Goldman Sachs and various New York financial interests. They're not going to do anything, and they're going to leave us out here to fend for ourselves. The best you can do is join a credit union and cancel your credit cards. This is not a consumer-friendly administration or a very optimistic turn of developments, whether you're in the cable TV business, the banking business, whether you have to fly places for work or play now and then. The pictures has grown darker on every front under President Obama's watch.
Wow. Okay. Rich Rubino, anything good can come out of this Comcast proposal?
So I take it Tom's undecided. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know. I'm kind of undecided about this, to be quite honest with you. I can see the positives and somewhat the negatives.
What are the positives?
We're going down.
What are the positives?
That's what I'm trying. That's what I'm trying
to. What are the positives?
It's a positive for the people, I guess, who work at Time Warner. I don't know. The people certainly, I guess,
they're all going to get fired when this. They'll be made redundant when this goes through. The reason you merge is to control pricing power and improve the productivity and do more with less.
Now
All
wait
those
a
people
second.
are going out on the street.
Now was Time Warner in trouble? Was Time Warner in trouble in the first place?
No, they're making plenty of money, but their shareholders can make out. They'll have a big payday if they sell out to Comcast, and then all those workers can be let go.
All right.
I met Comcast, I guess, and I guess this is kind of the synergy of media. It's amazing just how many you watch, whether it's ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox. They're all basically owned by some sort of a corporate conglomerate, by some sort of a corporation, and it really, I think, makes the case for the independent media. I will to shift a little bit in terms of, and this is what I've been saying just for weeks basically, about what a misnomer it really is. And it's almost laughable when people keep saying that Barack Obama is somehow a socialist, a closet socialist, or even an overt socialist.
Right.
No socialist administration would necessarily, first of all, they would not support the Trans-Pacific Partnership in terms of free trade or free trade agreements with Peru and all these other countries. They wouldn't have bailed out the auto industry and allowed them to pay the money back, or signed to health insurance reform, which gives 31 million new customers to the health insurance industry. And they certainly, under no circumstance, would support basically a corporate buyout like this, which I think, by the way, will probably get Senate approval. I know Senator Mike Lee from Utah and Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, the two members of this subcommittee that's going to deal with this, will probably give the green light to it. but it really shows that yes, the Obama administration, like pretty much every administration since the Johnson administration, has been corporately inclined. It's not necessarily different. It's just amazing to me that people still consider Barack Obama to be somehow a socialist who wants to put everything into public hands rather than private hands. This is still in private hands.
Yeah, I mean, in stark terms, here's why this is a terrible idea. Comcast, which controls an increasing number of cable systems in this country, also owns NBC Universal, which means it wants you to watch NBC and the NBC-owned channels like CNBC and MSNBC and so forth. It would rather you watched those channels than CBS or Fox. Now, let's say you like American Idol, which is on Fox, and the only way you can get a clear television signal at your house is via Comcast. So you really don't have any option. There's no competition. Let's say you get a message in the mail from Comcast one day that says if you want to watch Fox now, it's going to be an extra $50 a month. And you are outraged, but there's not a hell of a lot you can do about it. So a lot of people will turn Fox off at that price, which suits Comcast just fine because it takes the competition off the map. When they can block access by their competitors to the audience, they artificially control the market. And once you corner that market that way, it's very difficult to make that change that game, to introduce new competitors, because the barriers to entry now are so high. What are you going to do, build another parallel cable system? You know what that costs? So there is a real dystopian nightmare scenario here, and wait till they get a hold of the internet. You know, when you'll find that certain websites just don't work anymore unless you put more quarters in the machine. There's a real nightmare scenario here for the American people, which I don't think too many people see coming until it's too late. But everyone should be in the streets with lighted torches about this. And again, this is issue number 59 of 100 on which the president is dead silent.
See, and this is what I don't understand, Tom, that we talk about this stuff and we highlight these things, and yet the folks that are claiming he's a socialist, the Tea Partiers, the ultra conservatives, they're out there screaming and yelling that that this country is going to hell and back for other reasons. Why is the disconnect? Are people that naive or out of tune with what's really going on? I mean, why the discrepancy between the messages?
I would defer to Rich on that, because I think naive is a kind word for it, but I probably said enough.
I will give you one phrase: ideological echo chamber. That's what it is. There are people who get all of their news from sources that basically reinforce what they want to believe. I mean, if you're a conservative, you can listen to Michael Savage, you can listen to Rush Limbaugh, you can read the Wall Street Journal, you can watch Fox News, and you're going to get the exact same opinion. There'll be a few there'll be somebody like Bob Beckler who's going to give, just watch the 5 on Fox, for example. You have one liberal versus 4 conservatives, and they beat up on the liberal. Then go to the exact opposite, for example,
Rich,
for a liberal. You can listen to National Public Radio.
But I don't hear of the other stations, the other networks that are supposedly liberal-leaning bringing up the points that Tom is bringing up, or that you have brought up very often about why he is not a socialist in terms of the health care plan.
It's a good point. They kind of ignore the whole socialist thing, but I think that certainly, I think for the Obama administration, because they kind of see themselves as kind of defenders of him, just like, for example, in the 1980s, a lot of conservatives saw themselves as defenders of the Reagan administration, even though even though Ronald Reagan, nominated two moderates to the Supreme Court, one who was pro-choice. He signed a law regularizing basically 3 million illegal immigrants. He supported the Brady Bill. I think the same thing under the George W. Bush, for example, got away with a lot from conservatives by supporting the NEA, No Child Left Behind. I think MSNBC is more just like Fox was in during the Bush administration. They're seen more as kind of a tribune for the Obama administration than a tribune for necessarily liberalism. Whereas you go to somewhere like, for example, someone like Amy Goodman, for example, or The Nation magazine, which don't necessarily have any which don't necessarily support Obama per se as much as they support liberal ideals, you're going to get a lot different perspective. You're going to get a perspective from them that's going to, for example, be opposed to the sanctions on Iran, because of the effects on the human effects on the Iranians. They're going to be opposed to the drone strikes. You very rarely hear on MSNBC, for example, about the effects of the drone strikes. They just had 26 people died about a month ago in a wedding party, but because they misfired, and you rarely hear that on MSNBC. Just like in Fox, you rarely heard some of the more negative things about the Bush administration. Yet, if you go to some of the more conservative sources, for example, something like the American Spectator, or even on talk radio, Michael Savage, Rush Limbaugh, they don't say any allegiance to the Republican Party. If anything, they're hostile. They have enmity, certainly. We mentioned John Boehner or Mitch McConnell, for example, to Glenn Beck or Rush Limbaugh, and you would think that they were the reincarnation of Ralph Nader, Dennis Kucinich, and Hubert Humphrey amalgamated. Really, they created this chimera where basically the right and the left both do this. I'm not talking necessarily about the establishment right and the left, but the real right and the left, who basically believe that they hold all the truth, and that everybody else is basically either stupid on the one hand, which I think they would prefer them being stupid, or evil and misguided. I hear about the Obama administration, for example. I've heard people on the right say that, why they really passed the health care bill. What they really want is they want it to fail, so that then they will go to single payer and they will say, well, this failed. We tried, and they think that it's somehow this grand conspiracy. They're conspiracy theorists on both the right and the left, and my guess is that. My supposition is that 90% of them are getting all their information from sources which are reinforcing what they believe.
Of course, that's human nature. Tom, you're just one final word on this, because you've been quiet. Rich has been going on about this for 3 minutes now, so you get 30 seconds.
You got a clock on Rich. All right.
Time Warner was more your issue, Tom.
Well, I think it's a huge issue. I really do. And I don't think people understand quite how close they are to having their information options sharply circumscribed. And believe me, this would be the case if CBS bought a cable company, or Walt Disney which owns ABC, were to buy a cable company. You would try to stack the deck to your advantage. But I'll just reiterate that the central point of mergers is to consolidate pricing power, raise prices, choice, cut service, make more throw people out of work, and degrade the competitive environment. And that's what's going on here in spades. It doesn't make that much difference sometimes if there's one less can of soda on the shelf or one less slice of cheese in the supermarket. Yeah. It certainly makes a difference if the only way you can get a clear television picture is through a land baron, which is going to tilt the playing field so that you can only see a fraction of what you want.
All right, gentlemen, we've come to our final minutes. Let's do our final thoughts. What are we missing? What are we not talking about that we should know about? And Rich, you're going to go first. You've got 1 minute. What's something we should be watching for?
Yeah, I got another political one here. A very kind of bewildering development in the Virginia Senate race. Mark Warner, a former governor who was running for re-election in the United States Senate, wasn't seen as really being vulnerable this time around. Virginia is kind of a purple state. There's certainly hostility toward him for voting for the Affordable Care Act. But he's got job approval ratings over 60%. So why would Ed Gillespie, a very formidable candidate, a lobbyist and former chairman of the Republican Party, throw his hat in the ring, throw his hat in the ring and enter into this race and make it essentially and make it something that the Democrats will have to at least put money in to prop up Mark Warner? I think part of it is that the Democrats are afraid of Mark Warner in 2016, not as a presidential candidate per se, but as a vice presidential candidate, and they're trying to bloody him up a little bit. They want to give him a tough race, and they want to get him to say, for one thing, they want to make him promise that he will seek out his full term, would be one thing, and then in 2016, theoretically, when Hillary or Brian Schweitzer, whoever picks him as a running mate, then they will make him embarrassing when he has to, go on the ticket after breaking that promise. But I think they're very afraid of him. He's a businessman. He's the richest member of the Senate from the telecommunications industry. A very popular governor who left with a 70% job approval rating, and a very business-oriented, moderate to conservative Democrat. I think the Republicans really fear him right now. Okay, very interesting. Tom, you've had nothing to say this whole night. You've got 1 minute left. I was pleased to hear Rich sneak Schweitzer's name in there. I thought that was pretty deft. Still a guy to watch. Let's talk about the movies.
there is a great big $100 million plus movie being made of the Noah's Ark story by Paramount Pictures and the great director Darren Aronofsky. This thing has been in development for years, and it represents a huge bet for Paramount. By the time you market it and everything's going to be $200 million. Social conservatives, religious conservatives, have begun quacking and screaming about this movie months and months before its release, questioning whether it was too dark a portrayal of Noah. There's apparently a scene where Noah gets drunk. There are apparently scenes which are not ripped directly out of the Bible. But of course, the whole Noah narrative in the Bible is about this long, so you have to make up a lot of things anyway. It's a 2-hour movie. Paramount, so nervous about the backlash from social conservatives and religious conservatives, they began creating their own alternate cut of the movie in parallel with Aronofsky's editing procedures to try to pacify the religious right and see if they might like it any better. They began testing rough cuts of the movie with Noah shown various ways, some virtuous, some super heroic, and so forth, trying to pacify the religious right before this thing was even released. And it won't be out for months yet. A little terrifying how much influence the relatively small chunk of American society can wield over popular entertainment, especially when they have a track record of going after movies like Life of Brian and The Last Temptation of Christ and announcing how terrible and offensive they are well before they've been seen. So I sure hope we see the version of this Noah movie that Darren Aronofsky intended. Yeah. But anyway, I live in Seattle where it's February and raining. If I want to see a boatload of hopeless, depressed people and animals, I can just ride the ferries around Puget Sound.
That's an interesting point. Didn't even hear about it. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. Rich Rubino in Massachusetts. I know bad weather as it is here for me in Massachusetts, outside of Boston. If you're watching us on live, thank you for watching, and make sure you check out past episodes on YouTube and go to our Facebook page. Till next week, gentlemen, thank you for being on Politics is Sexy, and have a great night. Good night, everyone.
Good night, Eszter.
Good night, Tom.